Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff. It is May 9th, 2024, and tonight I am coming to you from the nucleus of Jewish life in America. That's right, Marble Falls, Texas, where, as it turns out, I'm about a mile away from a church with a big sign out front that says "No rules, just Jesus." So, to give you a taste of where I happen to be hanging out tonight, but I must say the people out here are also some of the most vehemently pro-Israel you will ever meet in your lives. Yes, they are hardcore Christians, but they have Israeli flags flying outside of their homes, and they'll gladly speak to you about Israel and tell you that they are praying for Israel if they happen to find out that you yourself are Jewish or Israeli. So I really have nothing but good things to say about the neighborhood that I happen to be in. But that's where I'm coming to you from tonight. And I'm glad to see so many of you here joining us for the live broadcast. If you can't catch the live one, you can always listen on Apple or on Spotify podcasts and see it online on my website, joelchasnoff.com/podcast. So a lot to talk about tonight. It's been really a very big and monumental week, both in Israel and here in the US, the two worlds colliding in ways I can't say that I or many of you are probably very pleased about. The title of tonight's episode is called We'll Always Have Paris. And it's called this because I'm going to reflect at the beginning of this podcast on an experience I had over the past week. I left Israel about 5 days ago to fly here to the US for this last leg of my spring tour. And during that trip, I had an unexpected overnight stay in Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, where I met a young man from Israel named Yehudah. Um, we both ended up in this hotel inside the airport itself, one of the most overpriced hotels I've ever stayed in my life. Nevertheless, we both ended up there and we were waiting in line, and I heard him talking in Hebrew on his phone. And he looked about 26, 27 years old. I figured he was on his post-army trip the way most Israelis will. After getting out of the army, they travel around the world to some extent, often in South America, which is where my two girls went. Others go to Far East, but many do backpacking in Europe. And I assumed that he was one of these. And he was explaining to his mom on the phone that he couldn't find a hotel room because this one was too pricey and the other ones were far away. And so we started talking in Hebrew just about why we ended up taking this flight. And I should give you that side of the story as well. It's very difficult to fly out of Israel right now. My daughter had a flight scheduled to come here to the US. It's been canceled a number of times by United. United has canceled all their flights out of Israel for the time being. El Al, in true Israeli style, has jacked up their prices enormously. So much for sympathy for the locals there. It's virtually impossible to fly out of Israel on El Al unless you're willing to pay really, really top dollars. So I ended up on this Air France flight and not really paying attention to the layover when I booked it. Didn't realize that I would be landing at 8 p.m. and taking off at 8:30 the next morning, meaning a 12 and a half hour layover with nothing really to do except to try to sleep. And I ended up meeting Yehudah, and we talked, like I said, a little bit in Hebrew in this lobby of the hotel. But as it would turn out, the next morning on our continuation to New York, not only were we on this same flight to New York, but we were seated next to each other on the left side of the plane. He had the window seat, I had the aisle. There was one middle seat open between us. And we ended up talking for a number of hours during this flight. It was about a 7.5 hour flight. And I got to say, we probably spoke for half of it. A very deep and very intimate conversation. And I'll tell you what I learned about him before I give you the takeaways from this conversation. First of all, he's not 26 or 27 years old. He's 45 years old, just happens to look very young. All the more surprising because he has 8 kids of his own. Uh, some of whom are army age, some of whom are already past army, some of whom are before. He himself is one of 12 kids. He was born in Jerusalem, and that's where he lives now. He's of what you'd call a kippah sruga, a modern Orthodox background. And I noticed that the night before when we were talking, I could see that underneath he had a V-neck sweater on, and I could see that underneath it he had tzitzit, the four strings, the shirt with the four strings that comes out that religious Jews wear. However, he was not wearing a kippah when we spoke in the airport. On the plane, he was wearing his kippah. And I asked him about that. And he said that he wasn't comfortable wearing the kippah in the airport with everything going on in France right now. He didn't want to attract unnecessary attention to himself. And he's also in his life, he's a pediatric orthopedist. And that's why he was heading to New York. There's apparently a big conference this week for pediatric orthopedists in New York City. And he was attending the conference along with some other Israeli physicians. But that's just the background. After this very long conversation with him, I really came away with three takeaways, which I want to share with you. The first is how incredibly easy it was to bond with him. And this is something that I feel is just so uniquely Israeli. I wrote about in the book Israel 201, which came out just about a year ago, and I know many of you have read. I paid a lot of attention to this incredible connection that Israelis have with each other. And it's more than just a connection, it's an ability to speak with other Israelis, even strangers, on a very intimate level right from the get-go. And this happened to Yehudah and me. We spoke about the challenges of raising kids in general and our marriages and our religious backgrounds and what each of us had hopes for in terms of the future of Israel. And we spoke politics and we differed politically a lot. I'll go into that a bit. But that didn't turn us against each other. It really just caused us to get a little bit closer as we asked each other about our points of views and to explain why we felt the way he did. As you maybe can imagine, maybe stereotypically, he's more right wing than I am. I tend to be left in general. And so we had disagreement over who we thought would be the next leader of the country, who we thought should be the next leader of Israel. Although what we did agree on is that no one is really clearly ready to be the next leader. We're sort of missing that vibrant, galvanizing leader who can take the country forward after this difficult time we've been in. That we agreed on. But we did differ politically in our views. But I was just struck by how easy it was to speak to him and how uniquely Israeli it is. There's this word in modern Hebrew slang, dugriut. It's actually an Arabic word. In Arabic, dugri means straight. Like when you're giving directions to someone in Arabic, you would say dugri, 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 and then turn right. Go straight, 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 and then right. But in modern Hebrew slang, dugri means straight to the point. There's no beating around the bush. And this can be very off-putting to tourists who come to Israel or Anglos like myself when we move to Israel. It's very shocking to be with the people who speak directly, bluntly, right to the point. I'm from the Midwest where we always beat around the bush and we mince words and we're so diplomatic to not hurt the other person's feelings. But the the downside of that is that we're not honest, and Israelis are honest. And one of the reasons that I think it's easy to bond with Israelis in these kinds of conversations is that everyone is completely honest, and we know that we're not going to hold back and we're going to listen to each other's opinions. And we might not agree, but there's an honesty there that brings us together. And so that was my first takeaway. It's just how neat it was to be able to speak with this complete stranger. And one of the reasons also that we were able to is because we're very tied up in the shared narrative of our country. I don't know that two Americans or two Canadians or two Australians could have this kind of intimate conversation with a stranger, but there's something about living in Israel where you feel a part of something bigger. You feel like you're part of something that matters, a mission, and that you're not just living out your life to have the house and the car and the garage, but because you care about the country. And when you meet other people who care about it as much as you do, it brings you together. And it's one of the reasons I live there. Maybe the number one reason, because Lord knows, every time I come to the US, I am reminded of how much easier it would be to live here. Economically, it would be so much cheaper. There's so much more space, so many parks and green spaces. And and activities for kids to do. My kid loves mini golfing. There's one mini golf course in all of Israel. When he was here a couple of weeks ago with me on my previous part of this tour, we went to 7 different mini golf courses in the span of our 2.5 weeks together. Just one example. So yeah, life in many ways is easier in the US, but what keeps me there is that connection with the other people, both on the macro level and the micro level when you can meet other Israelis like this and really get close to them. So that was my first takeaway, is just the bond between us. The second takeaway is how different we were politically and how he actually opened my eyes a little bit to the other side. I've always said in this podcast that I'm pretty sure Benny Gans will be the next prime minister, and I would support that. Just in my life in general, I've been honest with you and told you that I tend to be pretty left. In the US, I've always voted straight Democratic on the ticket, and in Israel, I've tended to supported a left of center party called Meretz. I wouldn't say they're way out there, but they're definitely left by all means. And they didn't even make it into the last government. They're not in the Knesset right now because of the way they all bungled their coalition. Labor, which is center left, did not join up with Meretz ahead of time. Neither one got enough votes to really cross the threshold, or Labor did, but not really enough to make an impact. And Meretz, by not joining with them, wasn't in the Knesset at all. So my party of choice isn't even in the Knesset right now. But I tend to be left, and I've tended also to make my views pretty clear about how I feel about Netanyahu and certainly the right-wing extremists Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. But I really listened to Yehudah as he talked to me. He said something that I'd never heard before. He said, we could never support Gans for prime minister because I could never support someone who on Yom HaZikaron, on Memorial Day, attends a joint Memorial Day ceremony with Palestinians who've lost children as well. This is a phenomenon in Israel lately, that there are these ceremonies where Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs and even Palestinians from the West Bank will have a joint ceremony, typically in Tel Aviv, and where they'll commemorate all losses of life, whether it's in soldiers who've been killed or terrorist attacks or Palestinians who were killed in Israeli military actions. And he said we could never support Gans because he attended one of these ceremonies a few years ago. Now, in the time since my conversation with Yehudah, I researched this and looked it up and could find no evidence that Gans actually did attend a ceremony like this. I think it would have been out there somewhere on the internet if he had. I saw a lot of accusations against him of being too liberal or too acquiescent to the Palestinian cause, but nowhere did I find that he attended the ceremony. But in a way, Yehudah saying this was enough of the indication of what he sees as the problem with a Benny Gantz type politician and those who are left of him. I wouldn't say that Yehudah, my new friend, outright came out and said that he loves Ben-Gvir or loves Smotrich. But I can see why he would support those in that sort of arena. I mean, say what you want about Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. They are right-wing extremists, but their first and foremost priority is the Jewishness of the Jewish state. And Itamar Ben-Gvir, in his campaign slogan, when he was running for office, his slogan was "Mi kan Baal Habayit," which means who is the landlord here? Who's in charge of this house? And he was really poking at the idea that what many in the religious community of Israel think, and I'm not talking about the ultra-Orthodox Haredim, I'm talking about Nit Yamaka, modern Orthodox community, feel that we are neglecting the Jewishness of the Jewish state, that too many secular Israelis want Israel to be a progressive, democratic state, no different from a Belgium or a Denmark, just happens to be a place where Jews can be safe and we have an army of our own, but really sort of neglecting the ethos, the Jewish ethos. And for Yehudah, who grew up in a religious family and who is religious now, like I said, a father of 8, himself one of 12 in Jerusalem, it's very important to him that Israel be not just a country of Jews or a country where Jews can go, but a Jewish country. And I could see his point. I still can't say that I support Ben Gvir or Smotrich maybe the way he would, but I think it can sometimes be easy to forget what Israel is supposed to be and that the mission statement of Israel is not the same as every other country in the world. We saw this week when Israel shut down Al Jazeera in Israel. And a lot of people could say, there's a lot of pushback outside of Israel for sure, even a little bit in Israel, not so much, but certainly in the US, that this was there's freedom of the press and you shouldn't shutter any publication. There's freedom of speech. But, I agree with shuttering Al Jazeera in Israel, not because I don't want to hear certain opinions I don't agree with, but because they were not reporting what is factually known to be true. They were denying certain aspects of October 7th, denying certain atrocities and causes of related to October 7th. And when you lie and lie in a way that demeans the Jewish people and the Jewish cause, then I can't see any reason why we should be supporting that kind of media inside Israel. Maybe in the US, but again, the mission statement of Israel is different than it is of the US. So, that was also a part of the conversation I came away with, is how he opened my mind to to that politically, that not everyone in Israel believes that we should make a hostage deal at all costs, and not everyone believes that Bibi is the be all end all evil of all evils to Israel. There are those that support him or certainly can go along with him for the time being, until the war is over. But it's very easy to fall into your little bubble, and certainly I'm willing to admit that I fall into mine. And so conversations like this are healthy for me as well. The last thing I came away with is just thoughts on Judaism itself. I when I lived in the US, we identified as conservative Jews. We lived in New Rochelle, New York. That was the last place we lived. Had been in Riverdale for about 10 years and then New Rochelle for 5. And we attended a wonderful, small, off the road map conservative synagogue called the Pelham Jewish Center. Bethel in New Rochelle is the big classic suburban synagogue, brick and a huge footprint and different sanctuaries. And we didn't want to go to that one. We went to this tiny congregation, which was literally inside what used to be someone's house and had been bought by the congregation and or rented. And it was very intimate and it was lovely. And we went probably 3 Saturday mornings out of 4. And I read Torah when I could. After college, to support myself, I was actually a professional Torah reader, so that's something I've always enjoyed. And, living in the US, we led a classic conservative Jewish life. Synagogue, like I said, 3 out of 4 Saturday mornings, definitely Friday night dinner, sometimes Friday night services at the shul, um, all Jewish holidays completely observed. And then when we moved to Israel, we became sort of classic secular Israeli. We still do Shabbat dinner every Friday night, but I haven't gone to a Saturday morning service once. And there's a good reason, I think. It feels extra, as we say in Hebrew, meyutar, which just means additional, not needed. When you live in the Jewish country where the national holidays are Jewish holidays and where everyone is speaking Hebrew and where the currency is the shekel, the same currency they use in the Bible, and you don't need to remind yourself that you're Jewish. I think so much about being Jewish in America and going to synagogue and observing holidays is about reminding yourself of who you are and what people you belong to. And in Israel, you don't need to do that nearly as much, maybe not even at all, because you know what people you belong to. And I've enjoyed that. I've enjoyed that expression of Judaism, of not needing the synagogue Judaism to go along with it, but just existing day to day. That is Judaism. But when I was talking to Yehudah and we were talking about one of his kids' upcoming bar mitzvahs and the synagogue they go to, and even just seeing him wear his kippah in public, it made me miss a little bit that element of my life that had more what you would call traditional Jewish ritual and religion in it. Um, in Israel, it tends to be more black and white. It tends to be all or nothing and hard to be sort of halfway. I find it easier in America to be sort of in the middle. If you wear your kippah in Israel, people assume that you are modern Orthodox. So just having a kippah on automatically kind of puts you in a corner and puts a pin on you. And so I don't wear one there, but it got me thinking that I miss it a little bit, and maybe even regret not giving my kids more of that Judaism. And that sort of struck me during Passover when, Passover, we only do one Seder in Israel and not two, which, believe me, is a huge relief. But after the first Seder, then we had a holiday, of course. The first day of Passover is a holiday. And then that night, my son, who's 14, asked if we could go out for pizza. And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, because Passover is over." And it made me realize there's a gap that when you raise your kids in Israel and don't give them Jewish education, that there's a lot they're going to miss out on. I mean, never in my life have I thought that Passover was anything but 8 days, or in Israel, 7 days. And here, my own son living in Israel thought that Passover was over after that first day. And so I had to sort of educate him from scratch. And it just made me realize that I do miss it, and that there are certain holes that will come up if you don't make an active choice to live Jewishly, even though you're in the Jewish state. So that was my third takeaway from my conversation with Yehudah. I will say that at the end, when we departed at JFK, we of course exchanged phone numbers, and we meant it. When I said to him, "If you need anything while you're in the U.S., I have family in New York, just be in touch," and I meant it. And we said we might see each other in Israel too. I gave him my contact info, and that that's something else that Israelis do. They mean it when they say be in touch. But it was yeah, it was I can't say it was life-changing, but it was impactful enough that I wanted to share it with you, and it showed me a real aspect of Israel and living in Israel that you really wouldn't get anywhere else. So Yehudah and I, we will always have Paris. In terms of news this week, it's funny. Throughout this week, as news stories came up, I thought, there's the lead news story for Inside Israel. And then the next day, there'd be another story that I thought, well, this one's got to be the lead. And I guess what we have tonight is a collection of a number of leads that any other week, this would be the number one story. But tonight, only one of them is number one. And what we'll start with, maybe not surprisingly, is President Biden's announcement that he is halting the shipment of certain weapons to Israel. And we're talking, as far as I know, specifically about 500 to 2,000 pound bombs that the fear would be that too many civilians would be killed, too many casualties if the U.S. were to ship these weapons to Israel. So how do Israelis feel about this? How do Israelis feel about the fact that Biden is halting the shipment of weapons that Israel feels it needs to fight this war against Hamas? Israel feels abandoned. Israelis feel abandoned not just by Biden and not just by the administration, but by the U.S. overall. And really, worse than abandoned, Israelis feel like we are being stabbed in the back. I mean, 24 hours before this announcement, Biden was giving a speech on Yom HaShoah about how we would never forget the Holocaust and how too much of the world had forgot the horrors of October 7th. That was pretty much his exact words, that too much of the world had forgotten what had happened on October 7th. And then a day later, he goes on CNN and publicly announces that he will not be supplying Israel with certain weapons because of worries about casualties to the Gazan population, which signals to Israelis that already Biden has forgotten about October 7th. Most Israelis, myself included, feel that this is a sellout for political reasons, that Biden feels caught because he's so afraid of losing left-wing progressives in his party, that he needs to come out and show that he is for the Gazan people. And let me tell you, Israelis do not want Gazan civilians to die. That is not our goal. It is not something we feel good about. It is not something we want. We already have, I believe, 10,000 cases of PTSD among IDF soldiers who have participated in operations in Gaza. And one of the reasons is because the number of civilian lives that have been lost at their hands. We do not want to be killers of civilians. No Israeli wants to be. However, for our own survival, we need to get rid of Hamas. And we are fighting an enemy that embeds itself among the civilian population. And so we're astounded. Not only do we feel abandoned and stabbed in the back, but we're astounded that Biden and the rest of the Democratic Party doesn't see this, that the only way that Israelis can feel safe is to get rid of Hamas and defeat them and to hold back, to tie our hands behind our back and hold back weaponry is pretty much Israelis feel just handing the keys to Hamas and sympathizing with them. Itamar Ben-Gvir has come out for under a lot of fire. He's come under a lot of criticism for tweeting Biden heart Hamas. That's what he tweeted. Biden heart Hamas. Biden loves Hamas. And there's been a lot of upheaval in Israel that he shouldn't say this and it's wrong. And it is not the type of thing you should diplomatically say. However, many Israelis agree with that sentiment. That is the message that Israelis are taking away, that Biden not only is supporting Hamas, but he's signaling to the rest of the world that the Hamas cause is justified. When to Israel, it is so clear what we are doing, the enemy that we are trying to fight, an enemy that is using civilian casualties to further its own cause. So that's how Israelis feel about Biden's announcement. Negative, stabbed in the back, abandoned, and hurt by it. Now, this relates to the next piece of news that I wanted to bring out, is that there is a chance that Biden is completely miscalculating here. A new poll came out this week. It was a poll of college students in the US. And, think back to all the media coverage we saw about Columbia, UCLA, other universities, University of Texas, Northwestern, which is where I'm from, Evanston. You would get the sense that this was overtaking college campuses. What this poll found is that only 8% of college students participated in these anti-Israel protests. Now, one reason is that many of the protesters were actually not college students at all. They're sort of paid professional protesters who happen to use and utilize college campuses and college students. Only 13% of college students named Gaza as one of the top 3 issues that they are concerned about. College students in this poll were given a list of issues: healthcare, the economy, social justice, racial justice, equal rights, freedom of the press, et cetera, the economy. 87% put Gaza last of all the things that all the options that they were given. Only 13% listed it as some kind of priority, and very few put it as number 1. So there's a chance that Biden himself is miscalculating here and overestimating how important Gaza is to college students in particular and to the American public overall. I think the American public by far supports Israel in this war and knows that this war began because of Hamas and what Hamas did on October 7th. I think also most Americans agree that far too many civilians have died in Gaza. I think most Israelis would feel that as well. However, we don't feel we have a choice. And somehow Israel has not properly communicated to the rest of the world the reason so many civilians have been killed. That maybe we needed to do a better job of doing. But I'm concerned that Biden will lose some of the Jewish vote on this as well. So he might gain some of the progressive vote, but he might lose some of the Jewish vote. I've spoken to many Jews who I know tend to vote Democratic the way I do, who've said that it's crossed their minds not to vote for Biden in this election. And I'll share a little secret with you. I've had a few moments where it crossed my mind as well. I am the last person you would ever think who would vote for Donald Trump. But let me tell you, if Nikki Haley were running, I would pull the lever for her in a heartbeat. And I think a lot of us would. And it even crossed my mind to vote for Trump simply because the idea of not just Biden's statement, but where the Democratic Party in America is going is frightening to me. And, I've never been a one-issue voter, but when our biggest ally doesn't support Israel, it's pretty hard to ignore that as an issue. Third piece of news, as you probably heard, Hamas rejected Israel's latest offer for a ceasefire, for a release of hostages. Now, I'm never the type to say, I told you so, but many, many times I have told you that there will not be a deal because Hamas has no incentive to have a deal. What was this latest offering that Israel made? Well, the New York Times, who is no fan of Israel, but the New York Times reported that this deal that Hamas uh, rejected, actually, I need to go back. It's not that it rejected it. Hamas said that it accepted the offer, but then when it presented the offer it accepted, it was completely different than what Israel had put forth, which means Hamas did not agree to the offer that Israel had put forth. So, what is the offer that Israel had presented? The New York Times reported that this offer that Israel presented was basically a cut and paste of Hamas's most recent offer. So basically, Israel just took what Hamas most recently requested and gave it back to Hamas and said, okay, we will agree to it. And then Hamas did not agree to that deal. They said they agreed to it, but what they really did was wrote up an entirely new agreement. And let me tell you what was in this new agreement. So it called for the release of 33 hostages, which already many Israelis are frustrated by the idea that we are getting hostages not as a group, but in pieces. We should be getting an agreement that calls for the release of all the hostages. No distinguish between elderly, female, male, soldier. All the hostages need to come back. So this deal called for 33 to be released. And it's bad enough that it's only 33, but what made it worse is that in this new deal that Hamas wrote up, of those 33 hostages released, very few of them would be living hostages. Most would be hostages who have already been killed. On top of that, for every hostage released, Hamas was going to request 50 prisoners from jails in Israel, Palestinian prisoners, be released for every one hostage, including 30 of its top leadership. Now, in the previous deal that Israel had put forth, which Hamas had agreed to, Hamas had written up, Israel would have a veto over who these 30 top leaders would be. Israel could veto them. In this new presentation, Hamas took away Israel's veto. And so this means they could choose their 30 most lethal leaders from Israeli prisons to have released, including murderers, organizers of mass suicide attacks. It includes prisoners who were released as part of the Gilad Shalit deal, but who were then re-arrested after that, many with blood on their hands. This new deal that Hamas wants would allow many of these Palestinian leaders, all of them, to return to the West Bank, which is Hamas's goal, that they would return to the West Bank and start stirring up insurrection in the West Bank and violence there and attack Israel from the West Bank. And so there's obviously no way that Israel can agree to this kind of deal. Now, Hamas came out and said they agreed to it, not notifying the world that they'd actually changed what the deal was because they wanted to seem to the world that they were agreeing to something. And then when Israel wouldn't, Israel would look like the bad guy. But you can see once again why Hamas has no incentive to make a deal. Because with Biden now cutting off arms shipments to Israel and so much opinion in the media against Israel right now and in the world against Israel, then why would Hamas need to compromise or give up anything at all? As far as Hamas is concerned, they are winning. So to Israel, it's very clear that Hamas really at this point does not intend to make a deal or want to make a deal. I guess the one question Israelis have is how is the world not seeing this? How is this not clear to the world? Because there are still people who are marching against Israel, saying ceasefire now, when it's Israel who's been the one who's presented terms for a ceasefire, saying if you just give us 33, not all the hostages, but 33 living hostages, we'll give you a number of prisoners. There will be a ceasefire. Hamas is not accepting this. And they're the ones who are keeping the conflict going, and yet the world is protesting Israel. So, Israelis in many ways, our heads are spinning. We just don't know what the world is coming to because to us it is so obvious. those were the three stories I wanted to share with you. News stories. Now I'm going to come to your questions. We had some good questions coming in this week. So Norm in Nevada wrote, Joel, assuming that the numbers put out by the Palestinian Authority with regards to casualties in Gaza is inaccurate, is there a relatively accurate count of people in Gaza killed during the offensive? So, Norm, here's how I'm going to answer this. First of all, it's not the Palestinian Authority, it's the Hamas-run health ministry that puts out the number of casualties in Gaza. And this is why we can't fully trust them, because it's Hamas putting out these casualty numbers. Now, in answer to your question of how many, Hamas has been saying it's around 34,000. And I must say, for the most part throughout this war, Israel has pretty much agreed with the numbers that Hamas has been putting out in terms of the numbers killed. It is around 34,000. What Hamas does not do, however, is distinguish between Hamas militant casualties and civilian casualties. Of the 34,000 casualties, deaths, we're approximating that it's about 14,000 of those are Hamas militants. That is a very high number, close to around 40%, I believe. Now, the United Nations itself has said that in most armed conflicts, 90% of casualties are civilians and only 10% are military. In this case, we're talking about 40% of the casualties being military. So this is way beyond in a positive direction compared to most other wars and conflicts in the world, including the ones that the United States has been involved in recently in the Middle East. But in terms of the actual numbers, it's about 34,000 deaths in Gaza. 14,000 of those are Hamas. And so it's not really that the numbers differ, it's how they're divided up because Hamas does not distinguish. We in Israel do. Eric in Toronto writes, he wrote a question about Rahim Mohammed, who is the son of Hamas, which is an excellent and I would say a must-read book if you want to understand Hamas and Gaza. And what Eric is asking about is recently Rahim Mohammed, the son of Hamas, who is literally the son of one of the high-ups in Hamas, and now no longer lives in Gaza, and he's very anti-Hamas. He recently warned of, quote, a disaster for mankind, unquote, if the terrorist group Hamas isn't destroyed. And so what Eric wrote in is to say that not much, at least in North America, is brought to the fore about internal dissension in Gaza, about Hamas and the viability of Hamas and how good Hamas is or bad Hamas is for its own people. Surely they are cognizant of these terror tactics perpetrated on Palestinians themselves by Hamas. So Eric is asking, what is the Israeli point of view on this subject? And is this angle being exploited in any way? And the answer is, Eric, we are not exploiting it. I think Israel needs to do more to push out into public some of these figures from within Gaza and within Hamas who grew up in the Hamas movement, who are now very anti-Hamas. We need to make them our spokesman, put them on CNN, put them in public spaces, and at least give their voice some air and some attention. Because when it comes from Jewish mouths and Israeli mouths, usually we are not paid attention to. So no, we are not exploiting that enough. But Israel really hasn't done a very good job with publicity since the beginning of since October, and so this is just one more aspect of it. But we really should be making more of the. It's not a large group, but there are certainly a number of very well-spoken and outspoken people from within Gaza and within Hamas itself who have turned on Hamas and who would be good spokesmen for the Israeli cause. Ellen writes in with a great question. She wrote, Passover is still on my mind, and I was wondering if you see a parallel between Hamas hardening its heart and refusing all the hostage deals that Israel has presented or blatantly changing them, and Pharaoh hardening his heart and refusing to let the Jewish people go. Wow, it's really a beautiful question and one I hadn't thought about, Ellen. I actually don't see a parallel here, and here is why. I believe that Pharaoh, for all his faults, had a practical reason for enslaving the Jewish people, which was to make them slaves, make them build up the infrastructure of Egypt. Slavery was more common back then. Uh, Certainly wasn't a good thing, but there was a practical element to what Pharaoh was doing, as evil as it was. Hamas, meanwhile, is pure evil and pure hatred, to the extent that they will see their own population die. Remember, what ultimately did soften Pharaoh's heart was the death of the firstborn and seeing his own firstborn die. And that's when his heart softened. Hamas, meanwhile, when they see their own children die, it actually strengthens their resolve and says to them, we need more of this. We need more civilian deaths, more death of children, because that is what makes Hamas look good to the world and turn the world against Israel. So I don't see a parallel. Hardening of Hamas's heart would imply that at one point it were any less hard than it is right now. And it has always been this. It has always been hatred, has always been evil. And so I don't see a change. Nevertheless, it was a beautiful question and one worth talking about. Final question. Linda wrote in. And this is a question about slice of life in Israel. I love questions that have to do with slice of life in Israel. What is it actually like to be Israeli and live in Israel? And Linda wrote in, last week, Joel, you spoke about summer camp in the US versus in Israel. I want to ask about summer school. A lot of high school kids here in the US go to summer school to get a jump on the academic year or to take care of electives. And I did that myself. Before I went into high school, before ninth grade, I took art over the summer just to get the art elective out of the way. So what Linda is asking is, do Israeli kids, specifically teenagers, go to summer school? And my answer, Linda, is, well, Israeli kids kind of barely go to school at all. I mean, that's a joke and I'm being facetious, but the truth is, school is much less rigorous in Israel than it is in the US. My own 14-year-old is in eighth grade right now. A typical school day for him is 8:30 in the morning to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. A couple days of the week, he stays until 2:30 in the afternoon, and he always complains that those are such long days, 8:30 to 2:30 in the afternoon with only one recess. And I tell him, back when I was a boy at Solomon Schechter, I went from 8:15 till 3:30, 5 days a week. Well, maybe on Friday I got it early in the winter for Shabbat. But there's not really summer school in Israel, Linda. There are schools that offer summer programs, and basically what this is, it's kind of daycare. So you can sign your kid up, and teachers at the school will, you'll let your kids run around in the playground of the school for 4 hours from 8 till 12 every day, 5, 6 days a week, and the teachers will like be on duty. They're on their cell phones, but they'll watch the kids and be supervising as the kids run around. But there's no real summer school, no summer school where you go in, take classes, get credits out of the way. Summer in Israel is called a Chofesh Hagadol, the big vacation. And I think I don't see Israeli kids either wanting to spend their big vacation, the Chofesh Hagadol, in summer school. So no, it's not really a thing in Israel. I must say that is as loosey-goosey and as light academically as Israeli schools can be. There are definitely aspects that certainly impress me. I'm very impressed with the math at my son's school. They're doing things in math that I was not doing literally until my sophomore year of high school, maybe even some junior year of high school in terms of advanced algebra and equations and matrices. Um, so I am impressed with that. Other things I'm thoroughly unimpressed with. My son takes Arabic. Arabic is a requirement in eighth grade, and his Arabic teacher notoriously just does not show up and doesn't send the lessons in time. And often teachers will not show up to class or will show up to class and tell the kids they can go on their phones. I mean, this would never be tolerated in the U.S., but in Israel, I don't want to say it's par for the course, but I'm going to say sometimes it's par for the course. So that's one of the things you do need to get used to if you move there. Now, in a moment, we are going to end with a piece of good news. How about that? But before we do, I'm just going to give you a rundown of some final notes. So this Monday, is Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day in Israel. And that's followed by Tuesday, which is Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day. In honor of those 2 days, I'm doing a special broadcast of Inside Israel on Monday at 1 in the afternoon Eastern Time. So try to join us Monday at 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. I know it's a daytime broadcast that might be hard for you if you have work, but of course you can see the recording on my website or listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. But this will be a very short one where I'll be talking about Memorial Day in Israel. What's it like? How is it different from Memorial Day in every other country? And how do Israelis make that transition? It's a very bizarre and painful transition from the saddest day of the year, Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, to the most joyous, Yom HaAtzmaut. They're back to back and on purpose, and we'll talk about why that is. And this year especially, it's going to be a very powerful transition. So I'll be talking about all of that. Join us at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Monday. That's May 13th. And again, if you can't listen to that, you can see the recordings of tonight or that one or any other on my website, which is joelchasnoff.com/podcast, and listen on Apple and Spotify. And if you do listen on Apple or Spotify podcasts, do me a favor, give it a rating because those ratings are the best way to help those platforms get the podcast out there. When you rate it, it sends a signal, hey, we're listening, it's important, and they will give it some love. So please do. Also, I don't know if many of you are on Instagram, but I do post on Instagram. So if you are on there, I would encourage you to follow me. I'm going to put my handle right here. It's at Joel Chasnoff on Instagram. And I post specifically for Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaZikaron. I've made some, I think, very nice videos that capture the poignancy of Yom HaZikaron, the transition to Yom HaAtzmaut, and the joy of living in Israel now. Those will be going up next week. I also always have pictures and clips from my tours. So if you are on Instagram, go ahead and follow at Joel Chasnoff. And again, I'm going to put the website here where you can see all broadcasts of the podcast and get the links to future ones. If you are not on my newsletter, Hebrew is Magic, that is where you get the links. Next week's broadcast of Inside Israel will be on Thursday night, May 16th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. It's on Thursday night because I am touring all next week for Yom HaAtzmaut, and Thursday is the first free night I have. So 1 week from tonight, 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, and of course, you'll get an email reminding you and with the link. So now, some good news to finish with. We need some good news. And the good news I have for you is that at Eurovision, despite the protests and despite the boos, yes, they were booing our singer. Despite that, Israel's Eden Golan has advanced to the grand finale this Saturday night. And the odds makers had her at number 8, but there are rumors that she could be as high as number 2 because something with the Italian judges accidentally leaked their results from the public poll. I'm not sure exactly how it works. I've never been like a huge Eurovision fan as an American. Like we didn't really know what it was until I came to Israel. I'd never heard of it. But I'm super psyched that Eden Golan is going to be in the grand finale. Let's watch. Let's cheer her on. Let's send her good vibes and send her some love because Lord knows Israel needs it and we all need it. Thank you so much for joining tonight. Again, this is Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff. I look forward to seeing you next week. As always, you can visit me at joelchasnoff.com and email me there. Send me your questions for next week's broadcast. I do hope to see you on Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for our special Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut session. Until then, Laila Tov, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'll keep the chat open for a few more moments. Laila Tov.